Welcome back. As philosophers, we love to pick apart even the simplest ideas.
It's true. What seems straightforward at first glance can quickly become, well, a bit of a rabbit hole.
Exactly. And today's deep dive is a perfect example of that. We're tackling markets, not just the everyday experience of buying and selling, but the whole concept, philosophically speaking.
Right. And to guide us, we've got the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which really digs deep. We'll be exploring all those big questions: what markets are they morally justifiable, the criticisms they face, how they relate to other parts of society. It's a huge topic, really.
It is, and I think especially relevant for us as philosophers, because understanding markets at this deeper level helps us make sense of economic and social systems.
Definitely. And the Stanford Encyclopedia gives us a great starting point. It's so well organized and thoughtful, bringing together all these different perspectives from across disciplines and history.
So where do we even begin? I guess at the most basic level, we have to start with exchange. That's kind of the heart of any market, people trading things.
Right. Though it's often driven by self-interest, which distinguishes it from other forms of exchange. Like, think of gift giving. Marcel Mauss did some fascinating work on that, how gifts are often about building relationships, not just a simple transaction.
Interesting point. And of course, in most markets, we've got money involved. It's that common medium that makes all these complex exchanges possible. And from that, we get prices.
And even with prices, there's variety. Sometimes people are price takers, meaning they just accept whatever the market dictates. But other times, like in bartering or auctions, the price is more actively negotiated.
Right. And we can't forget that markets aren't just about those individual exchanges. There are these macro effects too, like changes in overall price levels, inflation, all of that.
Absolutely. And another big concept is competition. In a market, everyone's trying to get the best deal, which creates this natural competition between buyers and between sellers.
And then there's the whole idea of a competitive market. Lots of buyers and sellers, comparable goods, and no one with a huge information advantage. Of course, that's often more of an ideal.
Yeah, even in seemingly competitive markets, there could be pockets of, let's say, less than ideal conditions. A town with only one major employer, or say a financial institution that has way more information than its customers.
Okay, so we've got exchange, prices, competition, but economy is a bigger idea, right? It's not just markets.
Right. We've got the legal framework, all sorts of organizations, households, corporations, which, as Seepley and Anderson point out, often have their own internal hierarchies. The state sector, charities, even black markets. It's complex.
It is, which reminds us that there are different ways to organize economic activity. Polanyi's categories are helpful here: reciprocity, redistribution, autarky, and markets. Market economies are just one way of doing things, not the only way.
And it's important to distinguish market economies from capitalism, too. Capitalism is a specific system, defined by private ownership of capital. It's all about generating profit. And that creates inherent power differences between owners and non-owners.
So markets are central to capitalism, but you could have markets in different systems. Like there's been a lot of discussion about market socialism, and Rawls even proposed a property-owning democracy. Both involve markets, but with a different approach to ownership.
Exactly. And that gets to Polanyi's distinction between a market economy and a market society. A market economy just means markets play a big role. But a market society, that's where market logic starts to permeate everything. Social relationships become transactional.
And it seems like a lot of the philosophical anxieties about markets revolve around that very distinction. How do we harness the power of markets without letting them take over every aspect of life?
Right. How do we reap the benefits without succumbing to what some might see as a kind of moral corrosion? It's all about setting boundaries, figuring out the appropriate scope of markets.
Okay, so we've laid some groundwork. Now let's get historical. How have philosophers thought about markets over time? The Stanford Encyclopedia points out that for centuries, the focus was mostly on the economics of the household, in oikos. There were exceptions, like Aristotle on money, but it's really the 18th century that things get going.
That's right. Thinkers in the 18th century, they start grappling with the bigger picture. Markets as a force shaping society, not just individual households. Schumpeter and Blaug, they really lay out this shift in economic thought.
And from that point on, we see these different schools of thought emerge. First, you've got the Friends of Markets. This lineage goes way back, from Mandeville to Adam Smith and the Scottish Enlightenment through 19th century figures like Malthus and Ricardo, and continues into the 20th century with schools like the Austrian School, with figures like von Mises and Hayek focusing on the power of free markets to process information efficiently. The Virginia School, with Buchanan and his emphasis on self-interest driving both economic and political behavior, and the Chicago School, which we associate with Friedman and his arguments for limited government intervention.
It's remarkable, isn't it? This diverse group, spanning centuries, united by a core belief in the power of individual freedom, expressed through markets to generate both prosperity and progress.
They see markets as dynamic, innovative, ultimately beneficial for society. Even if, and they often acknowledge this, the benefits aren't always equally distributed.
Right. And then we've got the opposite camp, the foes of markets. The Stanford Encyclopedia reminds us that even in the Middle Ages, there was skepticism. The prevailing Christian view was very wary of trade and profit-seeking.
And in the modern era, you've got folks like Rousseau, who saw commercial society as corrupting, and of course Marx and Engels, whose work, like the Communist Manifesto and Capital, laid out a powerful critique of capitalism and its inherent inequalities and exploitative nature. Their ideas continue to resonate with later thinkers in the Marxist tradition, like Kuskowski and beyond.
The foes tend to see markets as inherently unstable, prone to crises, and fundamentally unjust. They lead to exploitation, they erode social bonds, they create a system that benefits the few at the expense of the many.
And for them, a crucial question is, are there viable alternatives? In the 20th century, the focus was on centrally planned economies. Nowadays, as Wright and others explore, there's more of a search for alternative models, drawing on various forms of cooperative or democratic economic organization.
It's almost like the strength of their critique is tied to the perceived viability of those alternatives. If you can't offer a convincing alternative, the critique might lose some of its bite.
That's a good point. And then somewhere between these two extremes, you have the critical friends. They see both the good and the bad in markets. Maybe they think the benefits outweigh the costs, or maybe they believe the problems can be addressed through other institutions and policies.
Right. And that group includes a pretty diverse bunch. Hegel, who saw markets as part of a larger ethical framework. Mill, who is all about reforming markets to make them more just. Keynes, who stressed the need for government intervention to stabilize the economy, and of course Rawls, who explored the possibility of markets that are actually fair. And we can't forget the whole social democratic tradition, which, as Berman shows, has been grappling with these questions for over a century.
The common thread is this: markets are tools, not ends in themselves. They need to be shaped by politics, by ethics, to serve the common good.
The primacy of politics, they call it. The big question is, can this actually work? Can politics really keep markets in check?
Which is a debate that continues to rage on today. Now, it's also interesting to see how different academic disciplines view markets. Economists, as the Stanford Encyclopedia notes, often have a pretty positive stance. They tend to use abstract models, often assuming perfect rationality, like the kind of work Becker did, applying economic principles to all sorts of social phenomena.
Though even within economics, those models have faced pushback, particularly from behavioral economics. Kahneman and Tversky, Leibson, and others, they've shown how real human behavior often deviates from perfect rationality.
Yeah.
And let's not forget Sen's critiques of simplistic rational choice models.
Right. And then you've got disciplines like sociology, anthropology, history, which take a less abstract approach. They emphasize the social context, the embeddedness of markets, and they're often more critical of market outcomes. Each discipline brings its own perspective, its own methods.
And as philosophers, I think it's important for us to be aware of that, to understand the different lenses through which people view markets and recognize the strengths and limitations of each.
Absolutely. Now let's dive into the heart of the philosophical arguments for markets. Sen, in his work, makes a helpful distinction between justifying markets based on rights and liberties versus justifying them based on their consequences. So let's start with rights.
The classic argument here is about the right to private property. If you have a legitimate right to own something, you should also have the right to trade it, to exchange it freely. Restricting that freedom is seen as a violation of your property rights.
And the strength of that argument really hinges on how you view property rights themselves. For some, like Nozick, those rights are fundamental, pre-political, almost sacred. It's grounded in ideas like self-ownership or Locke's labor theory of appropriation. And for proponents of left libertarianism, like Valentine and Steiner, this is a bedrock principle.
But of course, not everyone buys into this naturalness of property rights. Many would argue that the state is essential for defining and enforcing those rights. They're not just out there floating in the ether. And when it comes to liberty, the understanding isn't always so market-focused. Thinkers like McGillivray or Pettit with his focus on non-domination, or Taylor and his neo-Republican view, they all offer alternative conceptions of what it means to be free.
So that raises a tricky question. What counts as an infringement on freedom in a market context? Is it just direct coercion by the state? Or can the very structure of a market society, with its inequalities and power imbalances, limit freedom even without direct state intervention, especially for those who lack the basic resources to participate fully? This is something that thinkers like Cohen and Ulsteretti have grappled with.
Right. And a strict focus on property rights and free exchange can lead to some pretty extreme inequalities. So the folks who defend markets solely on a priori rights, they face a choice. Either they accept these potential outcomes, or they have to admit that consequences matter and that maybe, just maybe, some kind of market regulation or intervention is needed.
Which some might see as a bit of a slippery slope. Tomasi, though, tries to bridge this gap. He talks about free market fairness, upholding economic liberties as fundamental while still making room for some limits in the name of social justice.
Interesting. So we've got the rights-based arguments. Now let's turn to the consequentialist ones, where the focus is on the outcomes markets produce.
Okay, so one argument, which might seem a bit counterintuitive, is that markets actually make society more civilized, more peaceful. It's the idea that by channeling self-interest into economic activity, you actually reduce conflict. Hirschman, he explored this idea, tracing it back to Montesquieu.
There are echoes of this today, like in McCloskey's work. But it's not without its critics, as Fumagalli points out. And even Hirschman later recognized the potential for markets to also unleash self-destructive forces. Bowles suggests that non-market institutions are crucial for counterbalancing those negative tendencies.
Another big consequentialist argument centers on the idea of desert. It's basically the notion that markets, particularly labor markets, reward people in proportion to their contributions. So where you end up in society is a reflection of what you deserve.
This ties in with ideas like luck egalitarianism, where income differences are okay if they stem from free choices, like choosing a tougher job for higher pay, as Oken suggested. Thinkers like Miller and Honneth have explored this connection between markets and desert, and of course you've got more free market proponents like Mankiw and Narveson, the latter arguing for the moral justification of profit.
But this whole desert argument gets really complicated. Do markets actually reward effort and talent? Or do things like your social background or luck play a much bigger role? That whole cult of personal responsibility, as Barry calls it, is often questioned.
And it's interesting, even some strong advocates for free markets, like Hayek and Knight, they acknowledge that market rewards aren't necessarily moral rewards. For them, justice is more about the rules of the game, not who wins and who loses.
Right. Though, as the encyclopedia points out, you can still argue for designing those rules in a way that makes outcomes more aligned with desert, which kind of shifts the focus from justifying markets themselves to justifying particular market designs. That's something that thinkers like Lamont and Herzog have explored.
Now, probably the biggest consequentialist argument in favor of markets is the one about efficiency. It's the idea that markets, driven by that invisible hand Adam Smith talked about, they allocate resources in a way that maximizes overall welfare without the need for a central planner.
And a key concept here is Pareto efficiency. Basically, a situation where you can't make anyone better off without making someone else worse off. Real-world markets rarely achieve perfect Pareto efficiency, but the idea is that they tend in that direction.
And this efficiency is often attributed to the magic of the price system. Prices convey information about supply and demand, coordinating all those decentralized decisions, leading to outcomes that are supposedly better than any central planner could achieve. That was Hayek's big argument. And Dorgan adds to this by pointing out that market prices reflect opportunity costs, how much of one thing you have to give up to get another.
Plus, markets create incentives for people to use their skills and talents in ways that benefit society. It's that classic butcher, brewer, baker example from Adam Smith. Though it's worth noting, Smith wasn't saying people are only motivated by self-interest. He was just highlighting how powerful that motivation can be.
And then there's the argument about innovation. Markets are seen as engines of innovation, allowing new ideas and technologies to flourish, providing capital for entrepreneurs, driving that process of creative destruction that Schumpeter talked about. It's this constant push for improvement that ultimately raises living standards.
But, and I think this is a crucial point, efficiency doesn't inherently guarantee a just distribution of wealth. As Sun pointed out, you can have a Pareto efficient outcome that's also wildly unequal.
Right. And the whole trickle-down idea that wealth created at the top will eventually benefit everyone, that's highly contested. We've seen market economies with very different levels of inequality. The institutional context matters a lot.
Though, even if efficiency isn't enough on its own, you could still argue that well designed markets can increase overall wealth, which can then be redistributed through things like taxes and social programs. That's kind of a consequentialist justification for markets based on their potential to facilitate distributive justice. It aligns with Rawls' difference principle, which prioritizes the well being of the least advantaged.
Though, as Freeman and others in the high liberal tradition argue, that kind of instrumental defense requires really thinking about which economic system actually benefits the worst off the most. It's not a given that markets will always be the best option, even if they can be tweaked to be more just.
All right, let's move on to the criticisms of markets. Probably the most common one is that they lead to inequality, to poverty. This was central to the Marxist critique back in the 19th century, and it's just as relevant today. Piketty's work on wealth and income inequality really drives this point home.
And while defenders of markets might quibble about the exact level of equality we should aim for, it's hard to deny that extreme inequality can undermine people's freedom, even without direct state coercion. If you don't have the resources to meet your basic needs to participate in society, your freedom is pretty limited, as Rawls himself acknowledged. And even relative poverty can lead to exclusion and diminished opportunities.
Which brings us to that thorny question of freedom and coercion in a market society. If your choices are severely constrained by a lack of resources, and that lack of resources is a result of how property rights are structured, can we really say you're free? Some philosophers like Cohen, Otsuka, Waldron, they argue that this kind of situation can amount to a form of coercion.
And Seth, she really gets into the nitty-gritty of this in her work on the limits of markets. She talks about weak agency, where people have very limited choices, they lack information, they're dependent on others. And in those contexts, markets can easily become exploitative. Think of the classic example of the power imbalance between employers and employees, especially in low-wage jobs. People with limited skills, psychological vulnerabilities, or precarious legal status, they're particularly vulnerable to exploitation in market settings. That idealized image of the rational, informed, sovereign market participant doesn't always hold up in reality.
And the whole idea that markets reward desert, that's also heavily criticized. Marxists, for instance, with their theory of exploitation, they argue that workers are systematically underpaid, deprived of the full value they create. And even Hayek, he pointed out that desert can be used to ideologically justify market outcomes, even if those outcomes aren't actually just.
Right, and the idea that markets promote equality of opportunity, that's often challenged too. The reality is your starting point in life, your social background, those things have a huge impact on your chances of success in a market economy. Barry's work really delves into this. And then there's the question of whether institutions like public education can truly level the playing field.
So even folks who like markets generally acknowledge that there are problems, what economists call market failures. Externalities, like pollution, the costs imposed on third parties who aren't part of the transaction, and public goods, like national defense, where it's hard to exclude anyone from benefiting and one person's consumption doesn't diminish another's.
Yeah. And these failures are well documented, like in economics textbooks by Moskal, Winston, and Green. But critics would say they're way more widespread than market enthusiasts often admit, and fixing them isn't always so easy.
The Coase theorem, for example, it suggests that you can solve externality problems through bargaining, but only if transaction costs are low. In real life, with complex issues and lots of people involved, those costs can be prohibitive. So market-based solutions aren't always practical.
And then there's the issue of positional goods, a term Hirsch came up with. These are things that get their value from being better than what other people have, status symbols, basically. The competition for these goods often turns into a zero-sum game, a rat race, where everyone's trying to get ahead, but no one really gains in the end. And the negative side effects, as Frank and others like Brickhouse, Swift, and Klassen have argued, they can justify some kind of intervention.
Which leads to a deeper question. Efficient at what? Sure, markets might be efficient at satisfying existing wants, but they also shape those wants. And critics would say they often push us towards consuming things that are easy and profitable to produce, not necessarily what's truly good for us or what we'd choose if we really stopped and thought about it. George calls this preference pollution.
Right. and standard economic models often just take preferences as a given. They don't really account for how markets themselves might manipulate our desires.
And then you've got the Marxist idea of alienation, where people feel disconnected from their work, from the products they produce, from each other. It's this sense of estrangement that Marx saw as inherent to capitalist production. Jaggi has offered a contemporary take on this concept.
And on a societal level, there's the argument that market societies undermine community and solidarity. It's that old line from Marx and Engels, all that is solid melts into air. Markets can create a world of fleeting transactional relationships, eroding those deeper social bonds that hold communities together. And as Polanyi and Hussein point out, even the creative destruction that drives innovation can disrupt social ties and traditional forms of solidarity.
Which connects to the broader communitarian critique of liberal individualism, articulated by folks like McIntyre and Bell, who emphasize the importance of shared values and a sense of belonging.
And of course, there's a longstanding critique that markets breed egoism, materialism. It's that idea that by constantly appealing to self-interest, they encourage a focus on getting ahead, on acquiring stuff, at the expense of more altruistic values.
And some empirical research actually supports this. Titmus's work on blood donations showed how introducing monetary incentives can crowd out intrinsic motivation. And similar findings have been replicated in other contexts by Frey and Nisi and Restaccini, who looked at the unintended consequences of fines for late daycare pickups.
Then there's the worry about the market mentality spilling over into other areas of life, even our personal relationships. This increasing commodification of everything, where even intimate aspects of life become transactions. That's something that allows Radin, Anderson, Sandel, Satz, they've all written about. Think of things like paid childcare or surrogacy.
Right. And Anderson's work is especially insightful here. He emphasizes how important it is to recognize that not all goods are the same. Some things just shouldn't be treated as commodities because it violates their inherent value.
Exactly. And there's a related concern that markets push us towards a kind of mindless materialism, valuing stuff over more intangible things, like relationships or experiences. That was Fromm's argument. And this overconsumption, it has environmental consequences too, contributing to resource depletion and climate change. That's something that Wright and Hardin have written about extensively.
So if we start commodifying everything, does it erode our ability to have truly equal and respectful relationships? That's a question that Sandel, Satz, and others have explored, particularly with things like votes or body parts. And there's the argument that certain institutions, like democracy or education, should be governed by principles of voice and deliberation, not just the logic of exit that prevails in markets. That was Hirschman's point, and Anderson applies it specifically to education. And Radin, drawing on Dewey, argues that democracy is about more than just aggregating individual preferences. It's about the pursuit of a common good.
It's like different spheres of life have different moral logics, as Walzer puts it. The morality of the bazaar belongs in the bazaar. And often, multiple arguments against commodification come together: the nature of the good itself, the potential for vulnerability and exploitation, the impact on social relations. It's complex.
It is. Though these arguments against commodification, they have their critics too. Brennan and Jaworski, for example, they argue that purely symbolic objections are often weak because what's considered sacred or taboo can vary across cultures.
Right. But as the encyclopedia points out, most real-world cases of commodification involve more than just symbolic harm. There are tangible consequences. And Satz reminds us that just banning markets isn't always the solution. It can just drive things underground, creating black markets that are even worse.
Which gets to an important point. We often talk about the market as this singular thing, but in reality, there are all kinds of markets operating in different contexts with different rules, producing different outcomes. So can we even make generalizations about markets? Philip's work really highlights this complexity.
Right. And a lot of the arguments we've been discussing, they're all things considered judgments. There are trade-offs, nuances, complexities, which is why I think you end up with that qualified endorsement view that we talked about earlier. It's not about being pro-market or anti-market. It's about recognizing that different markets have different effects, and that context matters a lot.
Another point to consider is this. When markets produce bad outcomes, is it the market's fault, or is it the fault of the institutions surrounding the market? Tomasi, for example, he argues that a lot of environmental problems stem from a lack of clear property rights for things like clean air and water.
Which is a fair point.
Yeah.
But critics might say, even if you could establish those property rights, the transaction costs involved in bargaining over them would be astronomical. So it's not always so easy to just fix things by tweaking the rules.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about how markets depend on other institutions. Let's dig into that a bit more. What are those essential preconditions for markets to even function?
Well, pretty much everyone agrees you need property rights, clearly defined and consistently enforced. And you need a legal system that can uphold contracts. Those are the bare minimum.
And especially in countries with weak or corrupt governance, the way those property rights are enforced can make a huge difference. Unequal enforcement can actually exacerbate inequality.
Absolutely. And it's those property rights and legal prohibitions that determine which markets can exist in the first place.
Yeah.
We don't allow people to sell themselves into slavery, for example.
One area where those property rights get really complicated is intellectual property, especially in the digital age with information and creative works so easy to copy and share. What are the right rules for copyright, patents, all of that? Schifrin and Boutang, they've written a lot about this.
And then, beyond those basic functions of enforcing property rights and contracts, you've got other institutions that can shape markets in significant ways. The German ordoliberal tradition, with folks like Eucken, they emphasize the importance of antitrust laws to maintain competition, which contrasts with the more laissez-faire approach that became dominant in the U.S., as Crouch details.
And sociologists, they point out that trust is really important for markets to work smoothly. Not every detail can be spelled out in a contract. A lot depends on informal norms, on a shared expectation that people will keep their promises. Durkheim, Beckert, Rose, they've all written about this.
And economic sociology, it really emphasizes how embedded markets are in social relationships. It's not just about these atomized individuals making rational calculations. Personal connections, networks, social norms, they all matter. Granovetter's work on embeddedness really highlights this.
And Fleekstein goes even further, arguing that the state actually constructs markets through the rules and regulations it sets. The way corporations are governed, the kinds of oversight mechanisms that are in place, all those things shape how markets actually operate.
Pister's work on the legal construction of financial markets is a great example of that. And then there's the whole question of how economic theories themselves can shape reality. Callan, for instance, he talks about the performativity of economics, how theories can become self-fulfilling prophecies by influencing how people perceive and act in markets.
And Mackenzie, he's shown how financial market participants actually use theoretical models to make decisions, so the models actually end up shaping the market itself.
And finally, there's the point Herzog makes about epistemic infrastructures. Markets are supposed to be good at processing decentralized knowledge, like Hayek argued, but that only works if there are institutions, both public and private, that gather, analyze, and disseminate information. Those infrastructures are often invisible, but they're crucial.
Okay, so we've established that markets are deeply entangled with other institutions. Now, how can we use those institutions to address the problems we've been talking about? The inequalities, the exploitation, the environmental damage?
Right. A lot of political philosophers, they take those criticisms seriously, and they argue for a more nuanced approach, where markets exist alongside institutions that can supplement or correct their outcomes.
Like, take the classic market failures. Economists, folks like Bautor and Cowan, they point out that things like externalities and public goods justify government intervention, regulations to prevent pollution, for example, or direct provision of things like national defense.
And Basu, he talks about the large number problem, where individually rational actions can lead to bad collective outcomes. Like his work with Van on child labor shows how even if no individual parent wants their child to work in a factory, the structure of the market can create a situation where it seems like the only option. And that's a case where regulation is arguably needed.
Even macroeconomic stabilization policies, things like central banks and government spending programs, those can be seen as a kind of public good aimed at smoothing out the ups and downs of the business cycle. Though, as we all know, the best way to do that is a subject of endless debate.
Then there's the whole welfare state, which has evolved largely in response to those criticisms of poverty and inequality. It's about securing basic socioeconomic rights, as Marshall described it, and promoting equality of opportunity. Redistribution through taxation and social programs is a big part of that, as Fleurbe discusses.
Though, as Deesh points out, it's not just about redistributing the pie after the fact. The way markets themselves are designed can have a huge impact on how the pie gets divided in the first place. And different welfare states take different approaches. Some are more generous, some are more focused on work incentives, and then there are more radical proposals, like a universal basic income, which folks like Van Parijs and Wiederquist have championed.
Kuhn, he famously argued that there's often a trade-off between equality and efficiency. The more you try to level the playing field, the smaller the economic pie gets.
Though that trade-off isn't necessarily inevitable. Kuhn himself thought that things like public education could boost both equality and efficiency. And Heath argues that well-designed non-market institutions can do the same.
And the Scandinavian countries, they offer a real-world example of how you can combine a strong welfare state with a vibrant market economy. They seem to be doing pretty well on both fronts.
Cunningham even argues that the welfare state, by reducing insecurity and fear, can actually promote innovation and risk-taking. If people aren't so worried about falling through the cracks, they're more likely to try new things.
But I think we also have to acknowledge that the traditional model of the state setting the rules, markets doing their thing, and then the state stepping in to fix market failures, that model is becoming increasingly inadequate. The world is just too complex now.
Absolutely. Globalization is a huge factor. With markets operating across national borders, regulating them becomes much harder. You get enforcement problems, regulatory arbitrage, a race to the bottom as countries try to attract investment by lowering taxes and weakening environmental protections. The whole issue of tax havens, as Deitch discusses, is a prime example of this.
And this has led to a surge in philosophical work on international markets. They have their own unique challenges, often involving huge power imbalances and weak institutional frameworks. The whole debate about global justice, with thinkers like Pogge, Caney, Brock, Blake, that's highly relevant here. How do we regulate international trade? How do we ensure labor standards are upheld? How do we address the resource curse that often plagues countries rich in natural resources? That's what folks like Barry, Reddy, and Wenar are grappling with. And there are proposals for reforming those international institutions, trying to create a more just and equitable global system. James, Rissa, Kuryanska, Christensen, they're all working on this.
And on top of that, you've got the sheer complexity of modern markets, particularly financial markets. Minsky's work, and more recently Herzog's, they show how prone these markets are to instability, to crises. And regulating them is incredibly difficult. You've got herding behavior, information asymmetries, regulatory capture where the regulators get too cozy with the industry they're supposed to be regulating. And even when you do intervene, the consequences can be unpredictable.
Which raises the question, do we need fundamentally different approaches to regulation? Maybe something more adaptive, more flexible, more focused on reducing systemic risk?
And the simple dichotomy of market versus state, it often obscures the power of corporations. Crouch, for example, he argues that in some countries, like the U.S., corporations have so much influence over policy that the state ends up serving their interests, not the public good.
And then, of course, we can't ignore climate change. So much of the environmental damage we're seeing is driven by market activity. So regulation is clearly part of the solution, but it's really hard to get effective global regulation. So there's a lot of emphasis on voluntary action by businesses and consumers, adopting more sustainable practices, shifting towards a green economy.
And maybe markets can be part of the solution too. They're good at driving innovation, so maybe they can help us develop new technologies and business models that are less environmentally damaging.
So one of the big takeaways here is that markets aren't isolated entities. They're deeply interconnected with all these other institutions, and those institutions shape how markets operate, for better or worse.
And sociological research like Hall and Soskis's work on varieties of capitalism, they show that different institutional configurations work better in different contexts. You've got liberal market economies like the US and UK versus more coordinated economies like Germany or Japan. They have different strengths and weaknesses, and what works in one context might not work in another.